Welcome to Rome's greatest theatrical disaster. Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a nice long journey back to ancient Rome. So go ahead and dim those lights, get comfortable in whatever cozy spot you've claimed for the evening, and let's drift back about 2,000 years to meet one of history's most spectacularly unhinged rulers. We're talking about Nero, Emperor Nero. The guy who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned, except he probably didn't actually fiddle, and the burning thing is, well, we'll get to that. Tonight, we're exploring the complete mental unraveling of Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus, better known as Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, because Roman names were apparently designed to put people to sleep even back then. This is the story of how a reasonably normal kid, and I use that term loosely, became one of Rome's most dramatically deranged emperors. We're talking about a man who killed his own mother, married a boy he had castrated to look like his dead wife, and spent most of his reign convinced he was the greatest artist who ever lived. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. But let's start at the beginning, because Nero's story really begins before he was even born, in the twisted family tree that was the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Picture this. It's 37 AD, and Rome is ruled by a family that makes modern reality TV look like a documentary about lawn care. Nero's mother was Agrippina the Younger, and if you think helicopter parenting is bad now, just wait until you meet this woman. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the sister of Emperor Caligula, and later the wife of Emperor Claudius. She was also, by most accounts, absolutely terrifying. Agrippina had what we might charitably call ambition issues. She didn't just want power, she wanted to birth power, nurture power, and then control power behind a throne. When little Lucius was born on December 15th, 37 AD, she reportedly consulted astrologers about his future. The astrologers told her that her son would become emperor but would kill his mother. Normal people might take this as a warning. Agrippina basically said deal, because apparently the emperor part sounded worth the risk. Nero's father was Gnaeus Domitius Aenobarbus, and by all accounts, he was not a pleasant man. Ancient sources describe him as violent, cruel, and generally the kind of person you'd cross the street to avoid. He died when Nero was 3, which honestly was probably the first lucky break the kid got. Though calling anything in Nero's childhood lucky is a bit of a stretch. See, Agrippina was not what you'd call a nurturing mother. She was more like a political strategist who happened to have given birth to her most important project. When Nero was young, she was busy plotting her way back into imperial favor after being exiled by her brother Caligula for allegedly plotting against him. Family dinners must have been delightful. After Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, because that's how most Julio-Claudian family reunions ended, Agrippina's uncle Claudius became emperor. And this is where Agrippina's master plan really kicked into gear. She needed to get close to the new emperor, and the best way to do that was through marriage. Never mind that Claudius was her uncle, the Julio-Claudians had long since given up on conventional family relationships. But Claudius was already married to Messalina, who was busy being one of history's most notoriously promiscuous empresses. Messalina was apparently so out of control that she once held a public wedding ceremony with one of her lovers while still married to the emperor. This did not end well for Messalina. She was executed in 48 AD, which opened up a convenient empress-sized vacancy. Agrippina swooped in like a hawk spotting a particularly plump mouse. She convinced Claudius to marry her in 49 AD, making her the new empress and positioning her son perfectly for imperial succession. The fact that this marriage was technically incestuous didn't seem to bother anyone much. Roman high society had developed a remarkably flexible attitude towards family relationships. Once Agrippina was empress, she immediately began phase 2 of her plan, making sure Nero would inherit the throne instead of Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. This required some delicate maneuvering because Britannicus was older and technically had a better claim to succession. Agrippina's solution was characteristically direct. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero as his heir, and then she systematically worked to undermine Britannicus at every turn. The poor kid Britannicus never really had a chance. Imagine being 13 years old and watching your stepmother and stepbrother plot to steal your inheritance while your father nods along obliviously. It was like a particularly vicious episode of a daytime soap opera, except with more political murder and fewer commercial breaks. Meanwhile, young Nero was getting quite the education in imperial politics. His tutors included Seneca the Younger, the famous Stoic philosopher, and Sextus Afranius Burrus, a respected military commander. On paper, this should have produced a thoughtful, well-rounded future emperor. In practice, it was like trying to teach nuclear physics to someone who's mindly interested in setting things on fire. But Agrippina didn't care about her son's artistic pretensions as long as they didn't interfere with her political ambitions. She had bigger concerns, like making sure Claudius didn't change his mind about the succession. Claudius was getting older, and older emperors had a troublesome habit of reconsidering their decisions. Plus, there were rumors that he was starting to regret his choice of wife. Agrippina, never one to leave things to chance, decided to take matters into her own hands. On October 13th, 54 AD, Emperor Claudius died suddenly after eating a meal. The official cause was listed as natural causes, but pretty much everyone suspected poison. The prime suspect was, naturally, Agrippina, who both had motive and opportunity. Some sources claim she used a poison expert named Locusta, who apparently had a thriving business in ancient Rome. Imagine having professional assassin on your business card in ancient Rome. The job market was certainly different back then. With Claudius conveniently dead, 16-year-old Nero became emperor. And this is where our story really begins, because everything up until now was just the opening act. The main performance, a 5-act tragedy with musical interludes and an extended death scene, was about to begin.
Part 2. The Teenage Emperor and His Helicopter Mother. So there we were, October 54 AD, and Rome suddenly had a 16-year-old emperor. 16. Think about what you were doing at 16, and then imagine someone handing you control of the known world. Actually, don't think too hard about that because the resulting mental image is probably terrifying. Nero's early reign started off surprisingly well, which should have been everyone's first warning sign. When things start off too smoothly in ancient Rome, it usually means someone's planning something spectacularly awful for later. But for the first few years, young Nero seemed like he might actually turn out to be a decent emperor. He was guided by Seneca and Burrus, who managed to keep his worst impulses in check while he learned the ropes of imperial administration. The problem was Agrippina. Having successfully maneuvered her son onto the throne, she apparently assumed she'd be running the empire from behind the scenes. She had spent years plotting and scheming to get to this point, and she wasn't about to let a little thing like her son's actual authority get in the way of her ambitions. Agrippina expected to be the power behind the throne, the puppet master pulling all the strings. She probably imagined herself as the real ruler of Rome, with Nero as her handsome, agreeable figurehead. This was her first major miscalculation, because teenage boys, even teenage emperors, have a predictable reaction to their mothers trying to control every aspect of their lives. The early signs of trouble appeared almost immediately. Agrippina insisted on attending Senate meetings, which was unprecedented for an empress. She wanted to sit behind a curtain where she could hear everything and presumably pass notes to her son like a particularly ambitious stage mother. The senators were horrified. Roman senators could tolerate a lot of things: corruption, incompetence, the occasional political murder, but they drew the line at having mommy sit in on government meetings. Nero, to his credit, seems to have recognized that having his mother micromanage his reign wasn't exactly going to enhance his imperial dignity. But extracting himself from Agrippina's influence was easier said than done. This was a woman who had orchestrated marriages, adoptions, and quite possibly murders to get him to the throne. She wasn't going to step aside just because her son asked nicely. The first real conflict came over Nero's love life, because nothing says I'm ready to be independent like teenage rebellion through poor romantic choices. Nero had fallen madly in love with a freedwoman named Claudia Acte. Now, freedwomen were essentially former slaves who had been granted their freedom, which made them completely unsuitable marriage partners for emperors. It was like a modern prince deciding to marry his barista. Technically not illegal, but definitely not what Mom had in mind. Agrippina was absolutely furious about the Acte situation. She had probably already picked out a nice, politically advantageous wife for Nero, someone from a powerful family who could strengthen their position. Instead, her son was running around Rome like a lovesick teenager, which, to be fair, is exactly what he was. The conflict escalated when Agrippina reportedly threatened to support Britannicus's claim to the throne. This was her nuclear option, her way of reminding Nero who put him in power and who could potentially take him out. It was political blackmail wrapped up in maternal disappointment, and it might have worked on a more conventional son. Unfortunately for Agrippina, Nero was not a conventional son. He was a Julio-Claudian, which meant he had been marinating in paranoia and political violence since birth. When threatened, his first instinct wasn't to compromise or negotiate. His first instinct was to eliminate the threat entirely. Poor Britannicus became the first casualty of Nero's growing independence. In February 55 AD, during a dinner party, Britannicus suddenly collapsed and died after drinking from a cup of wine. The official explanation was that he had suffered an epileptic seizure, but everyone knew better. Britannicus had been poisoned, probably by the same Locusta who had allegedly handled Claudius. Nero was developing quite the professional relationship with his poison supplier. The message to Agrippina was clear: threaten me and I'll remove your leverage. The message to everyone else was equally clear: the new emperor was perfectly willing to murder his adopted brother over a family dispute. These were not encouraging signs for the future of the realm. But here's the thing about Nero. He wasn't just brutal. He was also theatrical. He didn't just want Britannicus dead. He wanted everyone to know that he had killed Britannicus while maintaining plausible deniability. It was political murder as performance art, which would become something of a signature style for him. After Britannicus's death, the relationship between Nero and Agrippina became increasingly strained. She realized that her son was no longer the controllable teenager she had maneuvered onto the throne. He was becoming something much more dangerous, an emperor with his own ideas about how to use power. He began systematically removing Agrippina's influence from court. He moved her out of the imperial palace and into a separate residence. He stopped consulting her on government decisions. He made it clear that while he respected her as his mother, he was no longer interested in her political advice. This was probably the first sensible decision he made as emperor, and ironically, it set the stage for all his future terrible decisions. Without Agrippina's moderating influence, and yes, Agrippina was actually the voice of moderation in this relationship, which should tell you something about Nero's natural tendencies, the young emperor began to embrace his more extravagant impulses. He started spending more time on his artistic pursuits, much to the horror of his advisors and the Roman establishment. You have to understand, in Roman culture, there were very specific ideas about what emperors should and shouldn't do. Emperors were supposed to be dignified, martial, and focused on governance and military affairs. They were not supposed to prance around on stage singing love songs or competing in poetry contests. It would be like a modern president deciding to quit politics and become a professional dancer. Technically not illegal, but definitely not what people expected from their leader. But Nero was increasingly convinced that he was destined for artistic greatness. He started taking music lessons and practicing his singing voice. He started writing poetry and planning theatrical performances. He apparently spent hours in front of mirrors practicing his stage presence and perfecting his dramatic gestures. His advisors, Seneca and Burrus, watched this development with growing alarm. They had signed up to guide a young emperor through the complexities of governance, not to manage the artistic career of Rome's first imperial entertainer. They tried to redirect his attention to more appropriate imperial pursuits, but Nero was having none of it. The more his advisors pushed back against his artistic ambitions, the more determined Nero became to pursue them. This created a vicious cycle where Nero's desire for creative expression became entangled with his assertion of imperial authority. Criticizing his singing wasn't just artistic feedback, it was political insubordination. Meanwhile, Agrippina was watching all of this from her enforced exile and probably wondering if maybe she should have paid more attention to that prophecy about her son killing her.
Part 3. When your hobby becomes a human rights violation. So here we are, a few years into Nero's reign, and things are starting to get properly weird. We've got a teenage emperor who thinks he's the Roman equivalent of Elvis, a mother plotting her comeback from political exile, and a bunch of advisors who are slowly realizing that their job description should have included crisis management for delusional autocrats. By 58 AD, Nero's artistic ambitions were no longer a private hobby. He had started performing for small groups of friends and courtiers, which sounds innocent enough until you realize that when an emperor invites you to hear his new song, saying no isn't really an option. Picture being trapped in a room while your boss performs their original poetry, except your boss can have you executed if you don't applaud enthusiastically enough. The Roman elite were horrified, but they were also terrified, which created this bizarre situation where everyone had to pretend that Nero's performances were absolutely magnificent while secretly wondering if the empire had collectively lost its mind. Ancient sources describe audiences who were required to sit through hours of Nero's singing with guards posted at the exits to make sure nobody tried to leave early. Some people apparently faked their own deaths to get out of these command performances, which tells you everything you need to know about Nero's artistic abilities. But Nero wasn't content with intimate gatherings. He had bigger plans, much bigger plans. In 59 AD, he established the Nerana, a series of artistic competitions modeled after the Olympic Games, except instead of athletic prowess, contestants competed in music, poetry, and theatrical performance. This might have been a nice cultural initiative if it weren't for the fact that Nero insisted on participating in his own competitions and winning them repeatedly. Imagine organizing a talent show where you're both the contestant and the judge, and then being genuinely surprised when you win first place every single time. That was basically Nero's approach to artistic achievement. He created an entire festival structure designed to validate his creative genius, and then he wondered why people were calling him delusional. The Nerana also marked the beginning of Nero's obsession with Greek culture, which was another source of scandal in traditional Roman society. Romans had complicated feelings about Greek civilization. They respected Greek art and learning, but they also considered Greeks to be effeminate and politically weak. For a Roman emperor to embrace Greek customs so enthusiastically was like a modern American president deciding to conduct all state business in interpretive dance. But while Nero was busy planning his artistic revolution, he still had to deal with the more mundane aspects of being emperor, like having a wife. He had been married to Claudia Octavia since 53 AD when they were both teenagers. Octavia was Claudius's daughter, which made her Nero's stepsister, but by Julio-Claudian standards, that was practically conventional. The marriage was, by all accounts, miserable. Octavia was apparently a quiet, traditional Roman matron who probably spent most of her time wondering how her life had gone so spectacularly wrong. Nero, meanwhile, was increasingly convinced that he was too artistically gifted to be tied down by conventional marriage expectations. He wanted a wife who could appreciate his creative genius, not someone who looked bored every time he started practicing his lyre.
He was like a Renaissance patron of the arts, except instead of supporting struggling artists, she was enabling the delusions of the most powerful man in the world. Poppaea was also married to someone else, Marcus Salvius Otho, one of Nero's friends, which created a delightfully complicated situation where Nero was essentially stealing his friend's wife while his friend was expected to smile and pretend he didn't mind. Otho was eventually sent away to serve as governor of Lusitania, which was the ancient Roman equivalent of being transferred to the least desirable branch office in the company. But before Nero could marry Poppaea, he needed to deal with two significant obstacles: his current wife and his mother. Octavia was inconvenient but not particularly threatening. Agrippina, on the other hand, was still a major political force, and she was absolutely opposed to Nero divorcing Octavia for a woman she considered an ambitious social climber. This brings us to one of the most infamous episodes in Roman history, the murder of Agrippina. Now, killing your mother is considered poor form in most cultures, but even by Julio-Claudian standards, this was pushing the boundaries of acceptable family dysfunction. The fact that Nero spent months planning elaborate and theatrical ways to accomplish the deed just makes it even more disturbing. Nero's first attempt at matricide was almost comically overcomplicated. He arranged for Agrippina to attend a festival at Baiae, a seaside resort popular with the Roman elite. His plan was to have her travel back home on a specially designed boat that would collapse and sink, making her death look like an accident. It was like something out of a bad spy movie, needlessly elaborate, technically impressive, and almost guaranteed to go wrong. And go wrong it did. The boat collapsed as planned, but Agrippina was apparently a strong swimmer. She made it to shore and sent word back to Nero that she had survived what was obviously an assassination attempt. At this point, a normal person might have reconsidered their life choices. Nero decided to abandon subtlety entirely. He sent a freedman named Anicetus to Agrippina's villa with orders to finish the job. According to historical accounts, when Agrippina realized what was happening, she pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here," referring to the place that had given birth to such a monster. It's a dramatically appropriate last line, though probably not particularly comforting in the moment. The murder of Agrippina in March 59 AD marked a turning point in Nero's reign. He had crossed a line that even previous emperors had hesitated to cross. Sure, imperial family members had been killing each other for decades, but there was usually at least some political justification. Nero had killed his mother primarily because she was interfering with his love life and his artistic career. The immediate aftermath of Agrippina's death was telling. Nero reportedly suffered from nightmares and hallucinations, convinced that his mother's ghost was haunting him. He consulted magicians and performed elaborate purification rituals, trying to cleanse himself of the guilt. But he also seemed oddly relieved, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. With Agrippina gone, there was no longer anyone with the authority to check Nero's worst impulses. Seneca and Burrus were still around, but their influence was waning as Nero became more confident in his own judgment. And Nero's judgment, it turned out, was spectacularly poor. He began planning ever more elaborate artistic projects. He wanted to build a massive palace complex that would span several of Rome's 7 hills. He dreamed of performing in public theaters, not just for carefully selected audiences, but for the common people of Rome. He started talking about expanding the empire's borders through cultural influence rather than military conquest, as if he could somehow sing the barbarians into submission. The Roman establishment watched all of this with growing horror. They had tolerated a lot from their emperors over the years: corruption, cruelty, even moderate levels of insanity, but they had never had to deal with an emperor who seemed more interested in his artistic legacy than actually running the empire.
Part 4. The Great Fire and Other Career Missteps. And so we drift into the early 60s AD, where we find Emperor Nero fully embracing his identity as Rome's first imperial performance artist. By this point, he had been emperor for nearly a decade, long enough for everyone to realize that this wasn't just a phase he was going through. This was apparently who he was going to be, a singing, poetry-writing, lyre-playing emperor who treated the Roman Empire like his personal stage. In 62 AD, Nero suffered another loss when Burrus died, possibly of throat cancer, though given the suspicious nature of deaths around Nero, some people wondered if this was another convenient poisoning. With Burrus gone, Seneca found himself increasingly isolated as the sole voice of reason in an imperial court that was becoming less interested in reason by the day. Seneca, being a philosopher as well as a political advisor, probably spent a lot of time during this period contemplating the nature of power and corruption. He was watching his former student transform into exactly the kind of tyrant that Stoic philosophy warned against, and there wasn't much he could do about it except try to limit the damage. It must have been like being a driver's education teacher and watching your student decide that traffic laws are merely suggestions. Around this time, Nero finally achieved one of his major personal goals. He divorced Octavia and married Poppaea. The divorce proceedings were a masterclass in imperial gaslighting. Nero accused Octavia of adultery and barrenness, two charges that were almost certainly false, but conveniently impossible for her to disprove. Octavia was sent into exile, where she was later executed on Poppaea's insistence, because apparently having your husband's ex-wife alive somewhere was just too stressful. Poppaea's influence on Nero was immediately apparent and universally terrible. Where Octavia had at least tried to maintain some dignity and restraint, Poppaea encouraged all of Nero's worst impulses. She praised his singing, applauded his poetry, and generally acted like she was married to the greatest artistic genius who had ever lived. It was like having a personal hype woman, except with the power to influence imperial policy. Under Poppaea's influence, Nero's artistic ambitions reached new heights of absurdity. He began planning a grand tour of Greece, where he intended to compete in all the major artistic and athletic festivals. Never mind that emperors were supposed to stay in Rome and actually govern. Nero had more important things to do, like winning every possible prize for artistic excellence. But before he could embark on his grand artistic tour, Rome experienced one of the most famous disasters in ancient history, the Great Fire of 64 AD. And this is where we get to the famous image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Except he probably wasn't fiddling, and he definitely wasn't in Rome when the fire started. The fire began on the night of July 18, 64 AD, in the Circus Maximus area of Rome. It was midsummer, the city was dry, and the closely packed wooden buildings created perfect conditions for a massive conflagration. The fire burned for 6 days and 7 nights, destroying 10 of Rome's 14 districts and leaving hundreds of thousands of people homeless. Nero was actually in Antium, about 35 miles from Rome when the fire started. When he received word of the disaster, he rushed back to the city and immediately began organizing relief efforts. He opened his own palaces to house refugees, arranged for food supplies to be brought in from neighboring regions, and supervised the firefighting efforts personally. By all accounts, his response to the crisis was competent and compassionate. So where does the fiddle story come from? Well, first of all, the violin hadn't been invented yet, so if Nero was playing anything, it would have been a lyre. Second, the story seems to have originated with later historians who were looking for a dramatic way to illustrate Nero's supposed callousness and detachment from his subject's suffering. The reality is that Nero's response to the Great Fire was probably one of the most effective disaster relief efforts in ancient history. But that didn't stop people from blaming him for starting the fire in the first place. Rumors began circulating almost immediately that Nero had ordered the fire set so he could clear space for his planned palace complex, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. These rumors were probably false. Nero had plenty of ways to acquire property without burning down half the city,
but they fit perfectly with people's existing perception of him as a self-absorbed megalomaniac who cared more about his own projects than his subjects' welfare. The Domus Aurea was by any measure an absolutely bonkers construction project. Nero envisioned a palace complex that would cover roughly 300 acres in the heart of Rome, complete with artificial lakes, gardens, and a 120-foot bronze statue of himself. It was like deciding to build Versailles in downtown Manhattan, except even more extravagant and with worse urban planning implications. The palace featured a rotating dining room, walls covered in gold leaf, and ceilings decorated with precious stones and ivory. There was a massive octagonal room with a dome that may have been one of the first uses of concrete in monumental architecture. The whole complex was designed to showcase Nero's artistic taste and cultural sophistication, which apparently ran to aggressively ostentatious. But the most telling feature of the Domus Aurea was the colossal statue of Nero himself that was supposed to stand at the entrance. This bronze giant depicted the emperor as Sol, the sun god, complete with a radiant crown and flowing robes. It was essentially a 120-foot declaration that Nero considered himself divine, which was pushing the boundaries of imperial ego even by Roman standards. The cost of this project was astronomical, even for an empire as wealthy as Rome. Nero financed it through a combination of increased taxes, debased currency, and outright confiscation of property from wealthy citizens. He basically treated the Roman treasury like his personal arts and crafts budget, which didn't exactly endear him to the taxpayers. Meanwhile, Nero was still dealing with the political fallout from the Great Fire. The rumors about his involvement had seriously damaged his reputation, and he needed a scapegoat. He found one in Rome's small but growing Christian community, who were already viewed with suspicion by mainstream Roman society. The persecution of Christians that followed was notable not just for its cruelty, but for its theatrical nature. Nero didn't just want to punish the Christians, he wanted to turn their execution into a public spectacle. Some were crucified, others were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, and still others were used as human torches to illuminate Nero's garden parties. This wasn't just political repression, it was entertainment programming with a body count. Nero had found a way to combine his love of theatrical spectacle with his need for political scapegoating, creating what may have been history's first example of persecution as performance art.
The Christian persecutions were popular with the Roman mob, who enjoyed both the entertainment value and the chance to blame someone for the fire. But they also marked another step in Nero's transformation from a merely eccentric emperor to something approaching a genuine monster. He was no longer just making poor artistic choices. He was using his artistic sensibilities to enhance the cruelty of his political decisions. Part 5. The Grand Tour of Delusion. By 66 AD, Nero had been emperor for 12 years, and he was finally ready to embark on the project he'd been dreaming about since his youth, a grand tour of Greece, where he could compete in all the major artistic and athletic festivals. This wasn't just a vacation. This was Nero's chance to prove to the world that he truly was the greatest artist and performer who had ever lived. The decision to leave Rome for an extended period was, even by Nero's standards, remarkably irresponsible. The empire was dealing with revolts in Britain and Judea. The treasury was strained by the cost of his building projects, and the Roman elite were increasingly restless under his rule. A competent emperor would have stayed home and focused on governance. Nero apparently decided that his artistic career took priority over such mundane concerns. Before leaving for Greece, Nero made arrangements for the empire to be governed in his absence. He left his freedman Helius in charge of day-to-day administration, which was like putting your personal assistant in charge of a multinational corporation. Roman senators were horrified.
Being governed by a former slave was considered deeply humiliating, even when the alternative was being governed by Nero himself. Nero's Greek tour began in 66 AD and lasted for nearly 2 years. During this time, he competed in every major festival he could find: the Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, the Nemean Games, and many smaller competitions. He entered contests in singing, lyre playing, poetry, chariot racing, and even acting, because apparently there was no form of artistic expression that Nero didn't think he could master. And he won. He won everything. Every single competition he entered, Nero emerged victorious. The Olympic Games alone awarded him 1,808 first prizes, which should have been mathematically impossible given the number of events that actually existed. But when the Emperor of Rome enters your competition, the scoring criteria tend to become quite flexible. The Greek festival organizers found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't actually judge Nero's performances honestly; that would have been political suicide. But they also couldn't make his victories too obviously fraudulent, because that would have insulted his intelligence. So they developed increasingly creative ways to ensure his success. In chariot racing, for example, Nero was declared the winner of one race even though he fell out of his chariot and didn't finish. The judges ruled that he would have won if he had completed the race, which was a remarkable display of hypothetical athletic scoring. It was like awarding someone a marathon victory because they really looked like they wanted to run 26.2 miles. His singing competitions were equally farcical. Audiences were required to sit through performances that could last for hours, with guards posted at the exits to prevent anyone from leaving. Some sources claim that women gave birth during Nero's longer recitals, and men pretended to die just to be carried out of the theater. Professional applauders were hired to lead standing ovations, creating an elaborate theater of false appreciation. But here's the truly disturbing part. Nero seems to have genuinely believed in his artistic superiority. He wasn't just cynically collecting prizes for political purposes. He was convinced that his victories proved his exceptional talent. It was like living in a bubble of positive reinforcement so complete that reality couldn't penetrate it. While Nero was busy winning imaginary artistic competitions in Greece, the Roman Empire was slowly falling apart. The revolt in Judea was escalating into a full-scale war that would eventually lead to the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The treasury was running low on funds, partly because of Nero's building projects and partly because of his expensive Greek vacation. And back in Rome, the political elite were beginning to plot against him in earnest. The situation became so dire that Helius sent increasingly desperate messages to Nero begging him to return to Rome and deal with the growing crisis. Nero's response was essentially to tell his administrator to handle things himself. The emperor was too busy with his artistic career to be bothered with governing. This attitude finally began to catch up with him in 68 AD, when a series of revolts broke out across the empire. It started with Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gaul, who declared rebellion against Nero's rule. Vindex wasn't particularly successful militarily, but his revolt inspired others, including Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. Galba was a more serious threat than Vindex because he was a respected military commander with the loyalty of his legions. When he declared himself emperor, other provinces began to follow his lead. For the first time in his reign, Nero faced the possibility of actually losing power. The news of these revolts finally convinced Nero to cut short his Greek tour and return to Rome. But even then, his priorities remained characteristically skewed. According to some sources, he was more upset about having to interrupt his artistic competitions than he was about the threat to his rule. He reportedly spent his journey back to Rome practicing new psalms and planning future performances, as if he expected to resume his tour once he had sorted out this minor political inconvenience. When Nero finally arrived back in Rome in early 68 AD, he found a city that was no longer particularly happy to see him. The Senate was openly hostile, the Praetorian Guard was wavering in their loyalty, and the people were dealing with food shortages and economic problems that had been largely ignored during his 2-year artistic sabbatical. A rational person might immediately focus on damage control, maybe offered some concessions to the rebels, or at least tried to shore up support among the remaining loyal provinces. Nero's solution was to announce plans for a series of public performances where he would debut all the new material he had developed during his Greek tour. Because nothing says strong leadership during a crisis like a one-man show featuring your original compositions. The Roman elite watched this response with a mixture of horror and fascination. It was like watching someone respond to a house fire by deciding it was the perfect time to rearrange the furniture. Nero seemed genuinely unable to comprehend that his artistic pursuits might not be everyone's top priority during a civil war. But even Nero couldn't completely ignore the military situation. Reports were coming in that more provinces were joining the rebellion, and Galba's forces were marching toward Rome. Nero began making half-hearted preparations for his defense, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. He spent more time worrying about what would happen to his voice if he had to shout military commands than he did planning actual military strategy. According to historical sources, Nero considered several different responses to the crisis. He thought about fleeing to Egypt, where he imagined he could live as a professional entertainer. He considered throwing himself on the mercy of the Parthians, Rome's traditional enemies, apparently believing that his artistic reputation would transcend political boundaries. He even briefly contemplated appearing before the Roman people and singing so beautifully that they would forgive him all his political failures. That last idea really captures the essence of Nero's delusion. He genuinely believed that his artistic abilities were so extraordinary that they could overcome any political or military obstacle. It was like thinking you could end a war by performing a really moving interpretive dance. Part 6. The Final Performance. As we drift into June of 68 AD, the walls were closing in on Emperor Nero, though he seemed to be the last person to realize it. While he was still planning concert tours and debating the merits of different lyre tunings, the Roman world was systematically abandoning him province by province, legion by legion. The Praetorian Guard, traditionally the emperor's most loyal supporters, began making it clear that their loyalty had limits. When your own bodyguards start giving you the cold shoulder, it's generally a sign that your political situation has moved beyond salvageable. But Nero seemed to interpret their growing hostility as just another case of people failing to appreciate his artistic vision. The Senate, never particularly fond of Nero, even during his better years, finally found the courage to act. In early June, they declared Nero an enemy of the state and condemned him to death in the traditional Roman manner, being beaten to death with rods. This was the ancient equivalent of a very strongly worded letter, except with significantly more fatal consequences. When Nero learned of the Senate's action, he reportedly went into a panic. But even his panic was characteristically theatrical. Instead of immediately fleeing Rome or trying to rally his remaining supporters, he spent precious time lamenting what his death would mean for the world of arts and letters. "What an artist perishes with me," he allegedly cried, which has to be one of history's most self-absorbed last words. Eventually, even Nero realized that staying in Rome was no longer a viable option. He decided to flee the city, but in typical fashion, he couldn't do it simply. He disguised himself as a slave and slipped out of the city at night, accompanied by only a few freedmen. It was like a badly planned heist movie where the criminal mastermind insists on wearing a costume that makes him more conspicuous, not less. Nero's destination was the villa of his freedman Phaon, located about 4 miles outside Rome. The journey there became the stuff of legend, though probably not the kind of legend Nero would have preferred. According to historical accounts, he spent the entire trip complaining about having to travel in such undignified conditions and worrying about damage to his precious hands from brambles and rough surfaces. At Phaon's villa, Nero received regular updates on the deteriorating situation in Rome. Galba's forces were approaching the city, the Senate had officially transferred power to the new emperor, and bounty hunters were actively searching for the fugitive former emperor. It was becoming increasingly clear that this story was not going to have a happy ending. But Nero still couldn't quite bring himself to face reality. He spent his time at the villa composing what he intended to be his final poems and practicing funeral songs that he planned to sing at his own death. Even his suicide was going to be a performance, because apparently Nero couldn't conceive of doing anything without an audience and a soundtrack. The end came on June 9, 68 AD. Word arrived that Galba's cavalry was approaching the villa, and Nero finally realized that his time had run out. But even then, he couldn't bring himself to act decisively. He spent precious minutes debating different methods of suicide, apparently concerned about which approach would be most aesthetically pleasing. According to Suetonius, Nero's last words were "Qualis artifex pereo," which means, "What an artist dies in me." Even facing death, he remained convinced that his greatest tragedy was not his political failures or the suffering he had caused, but the loss of his artistic genius to the world. It was narcissism so complete that it transcended even self-preservation instincts. When he finally heard the sound of approaching horses, Nero attempted to stab himself in the throat but couldn't quite manage it. His freedman Epaphroditus helped him complete the deed, and thus ended the reign of Rome's most theatrical emperor. He was 30 years old and had ruled for nearly 14 years, which was actually a pretty good run by Julio-Claudian standards. The immediate aftermath of Nero's death was telling. The Roman people's reaction was mixed. Some mourned him as a patron of the arts and entertainment, while others celebrated the end of his increasingly erratic rule. But perhaps most significantly, Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family line that had ruled Rome since Augustus.
Part 7. Legacy of a deluded artist. So there we have it, the complete rise and fall of Nero, emperor of Rome and self-proclaimed greatest artist who ever lived. His death in that suburban villa marked the end of an era in more ways than one. Not only was the Julio-Claudian dynasty finished, but Rome itself would never quite be the same. The immediate consequences of Nero's death were chaotic, as you might expect when an empire's ruler kills himself while rebels are literally at the gate. The year 68–69 AD became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, as Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian fought for control of the Roman world. It was like a particularly violent reality show where the prize was absolute power, and the elimination process involved actual elimination. But perhaps more interesting than the immediate political chaos was how Nero's memory was handled by his successors. The new Flavian dynasty, founded by Vespasian, needed to distance themselves from Nero's excesses while also appealing to the parts of Roman society that had actually enjoyed his rule. This created a fascinating exercise in selective historical memory. Vespasian's solution was typically practical. He kept the popular parts of Nero's legacy while discarding the embarrassing bits. The public baths and entertainment venues that Nero had built were maintained and celebrated. The Domus Aurea was partially demolished and replaced with the Colosseum, which was both a symbolic rejection of Nero's self-indulgence and a practical way to provide the Roman people with even better entertainment facilities.
The Colosseum, in fact, was built right on the site of Nero's artificial lake, which seems like a deliberate piece of political symbolism. Where Nero had created a private paradise for his own enjoyment, Vespasian built a public arena for the entertainment of all Romans. It was like turning a billionaire's private theme park into a public stadium, except with more gladiators and significantly better urban planning. But while the new dynasty was busy rehabilitating Rome's infrastructure, Nero's cultural legacy proved more complicated to manage. The problem was that, despite his obvious political failures, Nero had actually been quite popular with certain segments of Roman society. The urban poor had enjoyed the free entertainment and public spectacles he provided. Artists and performers had appreciated his patronage and his elevation of their professions. This created an interesting historical phenomenon. Fake Neros began appearing throughout the empire for decades after his death. These were usually freedmen or slaves who bore some physical resemblance to the dead emperor and claimed to have survived his supposed suicide. They would gather followers by promising a return to the days of free entertainment and artistic patronage. The most successful of these pretenders appeared around 88 AD, nearly 20 years after Nero's death. He managed to convince a significant number of people in the eastern provinces that he was the real Nero, returned from exile to reclaim his throne. The Parthian Empire, Rome's traditional enemy, actually supported his claim and provided him with military assistance, which suggests that even foreign powers found the idea of a surviving Nero politically useful. These fake Nero episodes reveal something important about his legacy. For all his obvious faults, he had genuinely connected with certain aspects of Roman society in ways that more traditional emperors had not. His emphasis on entertainment and spectacle, his accessibility to common people, and even his artistic pretensions had resonated with audiences who were largely ignored by the Roman political establishment. This popular appeal also explains why Nero became such a fascinating figure for later historians and writers. He represented something unique in the history of absolute power, a ruler who was simultaneously terrible at governance and genuinely beloved by significant portions of his population. He was like a celebrity politician whose approval ratings somehow remained high despite his administration being an obvious disaster. The Christian tradition, understandably, remembered Nero quite differently. His persecution of Christians during the aftermath of the Great Fire made him a natural villain in early Christian literature. Some Christian writers even claimed that Nero was the Antichrist and that his death had been faked, that he would return to persecute the faithful before the end times. It was an interesting parallel to the fake Nero phenomenon, except with apocalyptic implications. Medieval and Renaissance writers were fascinated by Nero as a symbol of absolute power corrupted by artistic pretension. He became a cautionary tale about what happens when rulers prioritize their personal interests over their political responsibilities. Dante placed him in the seventh circle of hell, which seems about right for someone who turned imperial administration into performance art. But perhaps most enduring aspect of Nero's legacy is how he challenges our assumptions about leadership and power. Most tyrants throughout history have been driven by political ambition, military conquest, or ideological fanaticism. Nero was driven by a genuine desire to be appreciated as an artist, which somehow made him both more sympathetic and more disturbing than conventional dictators. He's for something almost tragic about an emperor who desperately wanted to be loved for his talents rather than feared for his power, but who was so disconnected from reality that he couldn't distinguish between genuine appreciation and terrified applause. Nero represents the peculiar dangers of absolute power combined with artistic temperament, a combination that produces not just political disaster, but a kind of performance art tragedy. His story also illustrates the weird ways that personality can shape historical events. If Nero had been born into a different family or a different century, he might have been remembered as an eccentric but harmless patron of the arts. Instead, he became Emperor of Rome at 16 and spent the next 14 years turning the Mediterranean world into his personal stage.
Part 8. The Psychology of Absolute Delusion. As we settle into the final stretch of our journey through Nero's bizarre life, it's worth taking a moment to consider what his story tells us about the psychology of absolute power. Because Nero wasn't just a bad emperor, he was a fascinating case study in how unlimited authority can interact with artistic temperament to produce spectacular delusion. Think about it this way. Most people go through life receiving regular doses of reality from their friends, family, coworkers, and random strangers. If you have a terrible singing voice, somebody eventually tells you. If your poetry is awful, your writing group lets you know. If you're making poor decisions, people who care about you stage interventions. These feedback mechanisms help keep most of us somewhat grounded in reality. Nero, on the other hand, lived in a world where contradicting the emperor could be a capital offense. From the moment he took power, he was surrounded by people who had every incentive to tell him exactly what he wanted to hear, and no incentive whatsoever to tell him the truth. It was like living in a hall of mirrors designed by sycophants, where every reflection showed you exactly what you hoped to see. This creates what psychologists might recognize as a perfect storm for narcissistic personality disorder. Nero had unlimited power, unlimited resources, and unlimited positive reinforcement for every terrible idea he ever had. He was essentially a case study in what happens when someone with artistic aspirations never has to deal with rejection, criticism, or market forces. The really fascinating part is how Nero's delusions became increasingly elaborate over time. He didn't start out thinking he was a divine artist. That belief developed gradually as he received more and more fraudulent validation for his performances. Each fake victory in Greece reinforced his conviction that he truly was the greatest performer who ever lived. It was like watching someone's ego become gradually more disconnected from reality with each artificial success. But Nero's story also raises interesting questions about the relationship between art and politics. In one sense, his reign represents what happens when someone tries to govern an empire according to artistic principles rather than political ones. He valued creativity over efficiency, spectacle over substance, and personal expression over public welfare. It was like trying to run a corporation based on interpretive dance principles. Yet there's something almost admirable about Nero's complete commitment to his artistic vision, even when it became obviously self-destructive. He genuinely believed that his role as emperor was to elevate Roman culture and bring beauty into the world. His methods were catastrophically misguided, but his underlying motivation was more noble than that of most tyrants throughout history. This creates a strange kind of sympathetic monster, someone whose intentions were arguably good, but whose execution was so disconnected from reality that he became genuinely dangerous. Nero wanted to be remembered as a great artist and cultural patron. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power combined with unlimited self-regard. The really tragic aspect of Nero's story is that he probably could have been a decent cultural patron if he had been born into a different position. If he had been a wealthy private citizen rather than emperor, his artistic patronage might have genuinely contributed to Roman culture. His enthusiasm for Greek arts and literature, his support for public entertainment, and even his personal performing might have been positive forces in a different context. But absolute power corrupted not just his moral judgment, but his artistic judgment as well. When you can force people to applaud your performances, you lose the ability to distinguish between genuine artistic merit and political submission. Nero's tragedy wasn't just that he was a bad emperor, it was that he became a bad artist as well, precisely because his political position made it impossible for him to develop genuine artistic skills. This connects to a broader theme in Roman history about the tension between Greek cultural values and Roman political values.
Romans had always struggled with their attraction to Greek art and learning, which they simultaneously admired and considered somewhat effeminate. Nero represented an extreme version of this cultural tension, an emperor who fully embraced Greek artistic ideals while possessing the ultimate expression of Roman political power. His reign can be seen as a kind of experiment in what would happen if Greek cultural values were given complete political authority in Rome. The results were not encouraging, which probably reinforced traditional Roman suspicions about the political reliability of artistic temperament. But perhaps most significantly, Nero's story illustrates how individual psychology can shape historical events in unexpected ways. Most major historical developments are driven by economic forces, military conflicts, or social movements that transcend any individual personality. Nero's reign, however, was shaped primarily by one person's very specific delusions about his own artistic abilities. It's remarkable to think that the course of Roman history was significantly influenced by a single individual's desperate need for artistic validation. The Great Fire of Rome, the persecution of Christians, the construction of the Domus Aurea, the Greek tour, and ultimately the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. All of these events can be traced back to Nero's fundamental misunderstanding of his own talents and role. This makes Nero's story both deeply personal and historically significant. On one level, it's the intimate tragedy of someone who never learned to distinguish between what he wanted to be true and what actually was true. On another level, it's the story of how one person's psychological problems can have consequences that echo through centuries. Epilogue: What an artist dies. And so we come to the end of our long, winding journey through the life and times of Nero, Rome's most dramatically deluded emperor. As you settle deeper into whatever comfortable spot you've claimed for the evening, it's worth reflecting on what his story tells us about power, art, and the strange ways that individual psychology can shape the course of history. Nero died convinced that he was a misunderstood artistic genius whose death represented a tragic loss for human culture. History has judged him somewhat differently, as a cautionary tale about what happens when absolute power meets unlimited self-regard. But perhaps both perspectives contain elements of truth. There's something genuinely tragic about someone who desperately wanted to create beauty and bring joy to others, but who was so corrupted by power and isolated by sycophancy that he lost all connection to reality. Nero's story reminds us that good intentions, without wisdom and genuine feedback, can lead to consequences as terrible as any malicious tyranny. His legacy lived on in the fake Neros who appeared throughout the empire for decades after his death, in the Christian traditions that cast him as a symbol of persecution, and in the literature and art that used him as a symbol of power corrupted by vanity. He became a cautionary tale, a historical curiosity, and a reminder of the strange ways that individual personality can intersect with political authority. But perhaps most importantly, Nero's story serves as a reminder that even the most powerful people in history were, fundamentally, just human beings dealing with very human problems: insecurity, the need for validation, the desire to be loved and appreciated for who they thought they were, rather than feared for what they could do to others. In the end, Nero got his wish. He is remembered as an artist, just not in the way he hoped. His greatest artistic creation was his own life, transformed through his choices into a kind of performance art tragedy that has fascinated audiences for nearly 2,000 years. And with that thought, we close the curtain on Emperor Nero, the man who turned the Roman Empire into his personal stage and died convinced that the world was losing its greatest performer. History, as they say, would be the final judge of that performance. Rest well, and remember, sometimes the most important audience for our life's performance is the one we never get to meet, the future, looking back and trying to understand how we became who we were and why we made the choices we made. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most spectacular examples of what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited self-delusion. The show, as they say, must go on, but at least now it can go on without us.